welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, thank you for stopping by this little corner of history. Tonight, we're not just looking back, we're diving deep into the world of ancient Greece, where sexuality wasn't hidden in shame, but celebrated as art, philosophy, and power. From giant phalluses paraded through city streets, to teachers instructing pupils with both knowledge and touch, from courtesans debating philosophy in bed, to temples of Aphrodite where intercourse was sacred ritual, Greece was a place where desire wasn't just permitted, it was carved in stone. So, are you ready? Sleeping History will take you back to a world where sex was philosophy and pleasure was part of mythology. In ancient Greek society, sexuality was not merely a physical act. It was an inseparable part of philosophy, education, and power structures. In what is often considered the cradle of Western civilization, sex was not something hidden or shameful. It was examined, debated, practiced, and even sanctified, forming a central axis in both personal and communal life. Unlike modern perspectives that tend to separate sexuality from morality and education, the ancient Greeks viewed physical pleasure as a tool for exploring the soul, beauty, and the nature of human desire. At symposiums, elite drinking parties that blended wine with philosophy, sex was not just present, but also dissected as a subject of serious intellectual discussion. The philosopher Plato, in his famous work Symposium, developed the concept of ideal love, eros, a journey that begins with bodily desire and gradually evolves into a pure spiritual connection between souls. But to reach that ideal, one first had to experience physical attraction and delight in beauty, especially the youthful male form, which was considered the higher standard of aesthetic perfection. It was not unusual for a student to love his teacher in the most literal sense of the word, and for the teacher to educate not only with words, but with physical closeness. In such context, sexuality was part of the educational process, a way to shape young men into ideal citizens in both reason and desire. At the heart of ancient Greek sexual culture was pederasty, a structured relationship between an adult male, erastes, and a younger adolescent male, eromenos, usually between the ages of 12 and 18. This relationship was not forbidden. On the contrary, it was often idealized as a noble tradition, almost a rite of passage. The erastes was expected to teach, protect, and guide. The eromenos was encouraged to learn, admire, and even allow himself to be mentored physically. The relationship had a ceremonial quality and was often monitored by society, seen as a transformation from boyhood to manhood. While same-sex love between men was widespread in ancient Greece, it was governed by a strict code. The adult was expected to take the active role. If a grown man was seen as passive or submissive, it was viewed as a disgrace, a disruption of the social order and a loss of masculine honour. Nowhere was sexuality more vividly present than in Greek mythology, where gods and goddesses seduced, deceived, transformed, raped, and committed incest, often creating monstrous offspring, all told without moral hesitation, as if these acts were simply part of divine nature. Zeus, king of the Olympian gods, was the embodiment of boundless desire. He turned into a swan to assault Leda, transformed into golden rain to impregnate Danae, and even became a white bull to lure Europa onto his back before abducting and violating her. Almost no creature, mortal or divine, was beyond Zeus's sexual reach. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and erotic desire, stood as the living symbol of irresistible attraction. She had an affair with Ares, the god of war, taught mortals the art of lovemaking, and was worshipped in temples where sexual rites, including ritual intercourse, were considered a sacred offering. Sex in Greek mythology had no moral boundaries, only power and pleasure. It mirrored the Greek worldview. There was no universal right or wrong, only strength and satisfaction. Divine desire was not to be judged, it simply was, natural, unstoppable, and often untamed. Among the many sexual customs of the ancient world that continue to puzzle, and often disturb the modern mind, few stand out as starkly as pederasty in classical Greece. This was not a hidden or taboo practice in its time. On the contrary, the relationship between the erastes, an adult man, and the eromenos, a boy in his early teens, was idealized, even celebrated, as a formative rite of passage. In the eyes of Greek society, this was more than a romantic or erotic relationship. It was seen as a system of mentorship and education, a way to mould the boy into a well-rounded citizen, physically strong, intellectually agile, and socially aware. Within this framework, love, desire, and even sexual intimacy were not condemned but viewed as tools to create a deeper bond between mentor and student. This was not an equal relationship. The Erastes was expected to take the active role. He pursued, taught, protected, and gave gifts. The Eromenos, on the other hand, was encouraged to be modest and reserved, not easily won over, but also not entirely dismissive. His reluctance was part of his youthful charm, and only once the relationship had matured could physical pleasure be legitimized. In city-states like Athens, pederasty followed a strict social code. Only boys of a certain age, generally those entering puberty, could be courted, and the relationship had to end when the youth reached manhood, marked symbolically by the appearance of facial hair. Any adult man who attempted to take on the passive role of an Eromenos risked public shame and accusations of undermining masculine dignity. Crucially, pederasty was not always a purely spiritual affair. A wealth of evidence, from painted pottery to plays and satirical texts, suggests that these relationships often involve sexual acts, particularly anal intercourse. However, these were often framed within philosophical rhetoric, as a fusion of eros, desire, and logos, reason, a dialogue conducted through both mind and body. Today, pederasty is a highly controversial and ethically condemned topic. But in ancient Greece, it stood as a symbol of enlightenment, a sacred bond between beauty, knowledge, and eroticism. It was a reflection of a society that carved its values in marble, and believed that the pursuit of ideal beauty included both the intellect and the flesh. If pederasty represented the blending of intellect and desire within the educational sphere, then the Dionysian festivals were the complete release of primal instincts, uncensored, ungoverned, and unashamed. Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness, symbolized everything that defied structure: instinct over intellect, chaos over order, liberation over restraint. And to honor him, the ancient Greeks held festivals that were less about worship in the traditional sense and more about shedding the self, rites where sexuality, intoxication, and physical abandon merged into something spiritual, something mythic. The Dionysia, most famously celebrated in Athens, began as agricultural rituals, marking the grape harvest and the cyclical fertility of the land. But over time, these events evolved into ecstatic communal celebrations, orgiastic in both spirit and practice, where wine flowed freely, drums pounded like heartbeats, and bodies intertwined in dance that blurred the line between human and beast. At the heart of these nocturnal rites were women, transformed into maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus. Draped in animal skins, wielding torches and the ivy-twined thyrsus staff, they danced in states of divine frenzy. Some abandoned their homes and children temporarily, retreating into nature, into forests, mountains, and into each other. Ancient sources and surviving artwork suggest that physical pleasure, far from incidental, was a sacred component of these rituals. Group sex, same-sex encounters, and symbolic couplings between gods and devotees unfolded amidst the chanting, music, and heady scent of wine. In some regions, these acts represented a sacred union between sky and earth, a divine consummation intended to bless the fertility of the land. No one was judged in these rites. Pleasure was sanctified. It was not base or shameful, but rather a vehicle through which humans could momentarily touch the eternal. Through the body, through ecstasy, through surrender. To the Greeks, Dionysus was not a distant deity sitting on Olympus. He was the instinct within, the slumbering force inside each soul, waiting to awaken through a glass of wine, a rhythm, a gentle touch. And in the Dionysian night, when all social boundaries dissolved, one was no longer a citizen, a parent, a name. One became godlike, or beast-like, or simply flesh, raw, unfiltered, and momentarily free from the burden of tomorrow. If the Dionysian festivals allowed mortals to dissolve into ecstasy and touch the wild, untamed side of the divine, then in the temples of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, pleasure took on a different role, one of sacred ritual, performed with reverence that bordered on religious devotion. In certain city-states such as Corinth and Cyprus, there existed a distinct group of women known as hierodules, sacred prostitutes who served in the temples of Aphrodite. Yet to call them prostitutes in the conventional sense fails to capture their place in society. These women did not sell their bodies for survival. They offered themselves as acts of worship, engaging in sexual rites as a means of invoking divine favour for fertility, prosperity and communal well-being. To the ancient Greeks, sex was not separate from cosmic function. Intercourse with a hierodule was not merely a physical act, it was symbolically union with the goddess herself, and in turn, the woman offering her body became a living vessel of Aphrodite, receiving, blessing and transmitting divine energy. Unlike common prostitutes, hierodules were neither impoverished nor marginalised. They were often cared for, educated and trained in music, dance and the arts of seduction, not as entertainment, but as preparation for their role in the sacred rites of connection between mortal and divine. The temple at Corinth was said to house hundreds of such women, visited by pilgrims from across the Greek world. Their service was not simply carnal, it was ceremonial. Some rites even required that young women offer their first sexual experience within the temple, as a symbolic gift to the goddess before marriage, a ritual transformation from maiden to woman, from innocence to generative power. In such moments, there was no shame, only sanctity, and a sense of participating in the eternal forces that governed nature and humanity alike. In the worldview of ancient Greece, there was no strict division between the erotic and the sacred, between flesh and spirit. The hierodules, with their eyes trained in desire and their bodies attuned to ritual, stood as living testaments to a culture where sexuality was not sin, but sanctity. An act not of shame, but of blessing. A union not only of bodies, but of mortals and gods. If you think sex toys are a modern invention, ancient Greece might just prove you wrong, while making you blush in the process. At the heart of this influential civilization, personal pleasure aids not only existed, but were openly used, widely accepted, and sometimes even crafted as artistic objects, integrated seamlessly into the sexual culture of the time. The most famous among them was the elisbos, a dildo made from materials such as polished wood, leather or smooth stone, often shaped in the form of an erect penis, and available in a range of sizes. These objects were typically coated in olive oil for ease of use, and were largely considered personal items, especially for women such as widows, female slaves, or those without regular sexual partners. Ancient texts, particularly comedic plays like those of Aristophanes, mocked both women and men for using olisboi, suggesting they were widespread enough to be sold in public markets. On red figure pottery, olisboi appear frequently, carried by hand, stored in boxes, or even dangling provocatively like accessories, both practical and playfully suggestive. But elisbos were only one part of a wider world of ancient sensual innovation. The Greeks also employed so-called sex pillows, ergonomically designed cushions that supported the body in more comfortable or creative sexual positions. These were sometimes embroidered and kept in private rooms within aristocratic homes. Some even featured slots designed to hold an elisbos in place, allowing hands-free use, a rather ingenious, if primitive, precursor to the modern vibrator. Then there were erotic statues, often housed in private homes or temples, including figures of Priapus, the fertility god with a disproportionately large, permanently erect phallus. These weren't merely decorative. Touching or stroking these statues was thought to bring virility, fertility, or, in some cases, pure physical delight. And let's not forget erotic art itself. Graphic illustrations on pottery that served as both educational tools and inspiration. These vivid scenes depicted sex in all its forms, between men and women, between same-sex partners, and even between mortals and gods, offering a striking glimpse into how unashamedly the Greeks engaged with desire. In many ways, they turned lust into aesthetics. All of this points to a fascinating cultural truth. In ancient Greece, personal pleasure was not taboo. It was supported, encouraged, and even elevated into something artistic. Whether with a partner or alone, in a temple or bedroom, sexual fulfillment was seen not only as natural, but as a vital part of living well, perhaps even a duty to one's own body. In the world of ancient Greece, sex didn't hide in the shadows, nor was it locked away behind closed doors as it would be in many later cultures. On the contrary, it stepped into the streets, appeared on stage, was carved by sculptors, and took its place in public life as a natural part of both spiritual and aesthetic experience. To the Greeks, the human body and sexual expression was a form of art. There was nothing shameful about depicting intercourse, an erect penis, or the nude form of a young man. Sex was a subject like any other, shaped, sculpted, painted, performed, and even praised. This is most evident in the countless ceramic vases discovered from the period, including the famous red figure and black figure pottery. These often depict explicit sexual scenes, not only between men and women, but also between men and men, threesomes, and even unions between mortals and gods. The poses are bold, the details striking, at times bordering on instructional. Far from being hidden, these vases were proudly displayed in homes, used for drinking wine, or gifted as luxurious tokens of appreciation. But sexual expression wasn't limited to the potter's studio. It also took centre stage, quite literally, in the realm of theatre, especially in old comedy, a genre performed during major public festivals. Aristophanes, one of the most celebrated playwrights of ancient Greece, famously brought erections, orgasms, and desire onto the stage with little hesitation. In his play Lysistrata, Greek women unite in a sex strike to force their men to end the Peloponnesian War, leading to scenes in which male characters groan, beg, and suffer, visibly and audibly, from enforced celibacy. Actors wore comically oversized leather phalluses strapped around their waists, parading across the stage, dancing, pleading, all to roars of laughter from crowds that included philosophers, merchants, aristocrats, and slaves alike. Sex wasn't just accepted, it became a tool of society, of politics, and of satire. For the ancient Greeks, pleasure was not something to be suppressed, but something to be explored, questioned, and even laughed at. It served as a mirror to human nature, a way to engage with instinct, to reflect on social tensions, and to provoke dialogue about deeper moral and civic issues. In that world, the body was not sinful, but meaningful. An erect penis might be a symbol of fertility, vitality, or simply a greeting, a welcome to the human experience itself. Amid marble statues celebrating the human form and terracotta vases depicting scenes of earthly pleasure, Greek mythology opens a stranger, more primal door, where sexuality spills beyond the boundaries of humanity and enters the animal world. Though not a common practice in daily life, zoophilia, sexual relations between humans and animals, frequently appears in myth. Far from being condemned, these stories are woven into the Greeks' fertility thinking, and their view of desire as limitless. The most iconic figure in this realm is none other than Zeus, the king of the gods. Renowned not only for his thunderbolts, but also for his insatiable lust, Zeus rarely seduced in human form. More often he transformed into animals to entice or overpower his mortal lovers. One of the most well-known myths tells of Zeus transforming into a swan to rape Leda, the queen of Sparta. From that bizarre union came Helen of Troy, considered the most beautiful woman in the world and the spark that ignited the Trojan War. In another tale, Zeus takes the form of a stunning white bull to seduce Europa, a Phoenician princess. After luring her onto his back, the bull plunges into the sea, carries her to Crete, and ravishes her on a deserted shore. These myths are not told with warning or moral judgment. Quite the opposite. They often celebrate the god's power to shapeshift and indulge in unrestrained lust. In the Greek worldview, the lines between human, beast and divine were blurred. Animalistic desire was not rejected. It was mythologized as part of the sexual order of the cosmos. Even outside mythology, some rural fertility rituals involved symbolic acts of human-animal union. In certain rites to Dionysus or Pan, the goat-legged god of the wild, worshippers wore animal skins and masks mimicking hybrid mating with the belief that this unleashed primal forces of fertility from earth and sky. Creatures like the Minotaur, half man, half bull, Centaur, half man, half horse, and Satyr, half man, half goat, embodied overtly sexual meaning. They weren't simply monsters to be feared, but living avatars of raw, untamed desire. At once terrifying and alluring, These beings represented the wildness buried within the human psyche. In this light, zoophilia in ancient Greek culture wasn't merely deviant, it was symbolic. It represented the collapse of boundaries between human and nature, between godly and bestial, between sacred and profane. In a world where divine lust might appear with hooves, feathers or horns, nothing was truly forbidden, only not yet wild enough to become legend. If you've ever thought that the image of the phallus belongs only in cheeky jokes or hidden sketches, ancient Greece is here to surprise you again. In this world, the penis wasn't merely accepted, it was celebrated, even paraded through the streets like a living deity. The phallophoria, or phallagogia, was one of the most distinctive religious festivals in Athens and many other Greek city-states. During this public ritual, citizens took part in lively processions carrying giant phalluses, crafted from wood, leather, or even bread, decorated with vines, grapes, ribbons, and flowers, and hoisted high as they moved through the bustling city streets. Leading the parade were dancers, musicians, and men, sometimes nude or semi-nude, wearing oversized artificial phalluses strapped to their waists. They sang bawdy hymns, beat drums, played flutes, and occasionally stopped to reenact symbolic sexual acts, all performed with theatrical flair and a sense of sacred comedy. No one blushed during these days. Instead, the streets rang with laughter, music, and the vibrant feeling of tapping into a primal current of fertility and joy. This was not embarrassment. It was ritual. In ancient Greek thought, the phallus wasn't just an anatomical part. It was a symbol of life, agricultural abundance, masculine vitality, and cosmic creative force. Parading the phallus wasn't meant to shock, but to bless. It was a prayer in motion, asking for fruitful vineyards, fertile women, strong warriors, and land blessed with divine energy. At the heart of this celebration was Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, and ecstatic chaos. Ancient statues often depict him in a state of drunken pleasure, wild-haired, with an erect phallus, a figure both humorous and deeply sacred. In his temples, wooden or stone phalluses were carved, displayed, and sometimes kissed as part of blessing rituals. In rural areas, infertile women were encouraged to stroke a wooden phallus 3 times, or sit upon phallic stones to receive life force from the god. Men, meanwhile, wore phallic charms for protection or virility, believing the symbol could guard them from harm and misfortune. These acts were not crude jokes, but forms of dialogue with nature and the body, expressed in deeply physical terms. The Greeks didn't hide their desires behind closed doors, they marched them down the streets in broad daylight, because in their eyes, life begins with that moment of rising energy, whether in crops, in cities, or in mankind itself. In the modern world, semen is often seen as something to be hidden, erased, or at best confined to private, carnal contexts. But in certain strands of ancient Greek philosophy and mysticism, it was elevated to something far more profound, the very essence of life itself. To some, it was not simply a biological byproduct, but a sacred fluid, a divine substance worthy of reverence, ritual, and even consumption. Scattered references in philosophy, alchemical writings, and esoteric rituals suggest that semen, sperma, was believed to contain the soul, the essence, and the vital energy of a man. In certain philosophical traditions, especially within the Orphic Mysteries, a mystical belief system popular among the Greek intelligentsia, semen was seen as a sacred link between man and the divine. Some ancient rituals describe semen being mixed with wine or honey, and consumed as part of sacrificial or revelatory rites. The belief that by ingesting it one could absorb not only the life force of the donor, but also his knowledge, courage, and divine spark. In some schools of thought, male orgasm was considered a fleeting moment of transcendence, a brush with godhood, and the act of preserving or sharing semen became a deeply symbolic gesture, far removed from earthly lust. Not everyone accepted these ideas, of course, but ancient Greek philosophy, in all its radical diversity, rarely shied away from the taboo. Instead, it often welcomed them as material for speculation, experimentation, and existential exploration. Take Diogenes, the Cynic philosopher, who famously argued that public masturbation was a philosophical act. Why? because it demonstrated human self-sufficiency, a rejection of social norms and an embrace of nature's simplicity. If only rubbing my stomach could satisfy hunger, he mused, then I should be able to ease desire on the spot. Odysseus. For Diogenes, pleasure wasn't shameful, and semen was not a stain, but a mark of natural truth. In certain ancient alchemical texts, semen was even linked to the concept of a vital elixir, a key ingredient in the creation of the philosopher's stone or in rites of inner illumination. It carried within it the power to generate life, and therefore, to absorb it was to absorb the divine creative force itself. Of course, such practices were never mainstream, but their presence in ancient texts reveals deeper truth. In the worldview of classical Greece, the boundaries between soul and body, knowledge and desire were fluid. What modern culture may dismiss as waste, the ancients sometimes saw as a key, a potent gateway between man and cosmos. In ancient Greek society, where sexuality was neither hidden nor censored, but rather discussed, ritualized and woven into the public and intellectual fabric, anal intercourse held a notable place in both practice and philosophical symbolism. Especially within same-sex male relationships, it was not stigmatized but understood within a specific set of cultural norms and values. To the ancient Greeks, sex was not merely a physical act. It was a discourse about power, hierarchy, and identity. Within that worldview, the female reproductive system, especially the womb, was often associated with chaos, disorder, and the physical burden of childbirth. In contrast, the male body, particularly the male posterior, was considered untainted by such processes, and thus could represent a more idealized or rational form of erotic engagement. This perspective helps explain why anal sex, particularly between men, was not only tolerated, but, under certain circumstances, even idealized, so long as social roles were maintained. In such dynamics, especially in relationships like pederasty, a mentorship bond between an adult male and an adolescent boy, the adult, known as the erastus, was expected to assume the active dominant role, the mentor, protector, and initiator. The youth, eromenos, was expected to be passive, modest, and receptive, traits associated with the learning and coming-of-age process. Crucially, these roles were not interchangeable. If an adult man were to assume the passive role, becoming the recipient in sexual terms, he could lose social standing and be perceived as having abandoned masculine virtue. Such behaviour was considered shameful, not due to the act itself, but because it disrupted the expected hierarchy of gender and status. This complex understanding was not just philosophical. It found expression in art and material culture. Hundreds of painted vases from the classical period depict erotic scenes between male pairs, often illustrating these social roles with visual clarity. Far from being hidden, these images were used in social settings such as symposia, elite drinking parties, where philosophical debates and physical pleasures often intersected. From a modern perspective, such views raise serious ethical and social questions, particularly around age and consent. But within their historical context, these relationships functioned according to a very different moral and educational framework, one where sexuality, pedagogy, and power were deeply intertwined. In ancient Greece, sexuality was not just a private matter, it was a structured, visible, and often philosophical component of how society understood hierarchy, education, and the human condition itself. In the world of ancient Greece, where sexuality was not merely instinct but also symbol, metaphor, and political instrument, the heterai stood as living testaments to the perfect fusion of intellect, sensuality, and soft power. Unlike the ponnai, common prostitutes who sold their bodies out of necessity, the heterae were high-class courtesans, trained from a young age to become ideal companions for powerful men. They were not only skilled in the art of lovemaking, but also well-versed in philosophy, poetry, music, rhetoric, and the subtle persuasion of both word and body. A talented hetaera could debate a philosopher on the nature of beauty, and then melt him in her embrace, leaving him with the impression that this was not a transactional encounter, but an experience too elevated, too abstract, too close to art. Heterae were not bound by marriage or family. On the contrary, they lived freely, possessed their own wealth, and were often the confidants, sometimes even political or military advisors, to prominent figures. One of the most well-known heterae was Aspasia, the companion, an intellectual peer, of Pericles, the great Athenian leader. She's said to have composed speeches for him, engaged in philosophical dialogues with Socrates, and held her own at symposiums alongside the city's leading minds. The symposium, those all-male drinking parties, was where heterae shone brightest. They did not merely dance, play music and pour wine, they challenged guests with riddles, engaged in philosophical banter, and wielded satire with razor-sharp wit. And when the lamps dimmed, the wine took hold, and the philosophy gave way, physical pleasure followed as a natural, almost inevitable, continuation of intellectual seduction. For many educated men, heterae were the space in which they could experience their manhood in full, free from the moral expectations of marriage, domestic duty, or civic restraint. Wives, by custom, were kept indoors, uneducated and tasked with producing heirs. Heterae, by contrast, were freedom incarnate, a playground for thought and desire. In a society that revered reason yet did not deny the flesh, heterae were not on the margins. They were guides into the deepest conversations, armed with soft lips and sharper minds, capable of bringing even the most powerful to their knees not from lust alone, but from pure intellectual surrender. For the hetaira, sex was never just an act. It was an art form, a dialectic of the body and a pathway to beauty in the purest sense of the Hellenic world. While many cultures have treated prostitution as a shameful vice to be hidden or repressed, in ancient Athens, the cradle of philosophy, democracy and rational thought, sex work was legalized, systematically organized, and even taxed like any other profession. The man behind this policy was none other than Solon, the great lawmaker and architect of Athenian democracy. Alongside his constitutional reforms, Solon also legalized brothels, viewing them as a moral and political solution to maintain social stability. In his eyes, sexuality should not be suppressed, but rather managed, regulated, and transformed into a source of public revenue. Thus, the first state-sanctioned brothels of Athens were established, strategically placed near markets, ports, or densely populated neighbourhoods. These establishments operated openly, with signboards, set hours, and state oversight. Taxes collected from them were channeled into public works and even helped fund major religious festivals. Inside these brothels, sex workers were categorised across various levels, from the pornai, who offered quick, low-cost services in or near the marketplace, to elite hetairae, who lived in private villas, surrounded by luxury, with attendants, musicians, and even professional scribes to help draft love letters for clients. Many brothel rooms were adorned with erotic wall paintings, depictions of intercourse, exaggerated phalluses, and gods in the act of lovemaking with mortals. These images were not merely titillating, they were cultural affirmations of pleasure as a vital part of life. In ancient Greece, sex was not a private shame. It took place in spaces designed to celebrate life and beauty. Though prostitutes had no political rights, they often enjoyed economic independence, social freedom, and, in the case of heterae, subtle political influence. Some even rose to become brothel owners, employing others and building wealth from the very industry that the state had recognised and legitimised. One story tells of a brothel so successful that its tax revenue alone was enough to build a temple to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. In this sense, pleasure did not just nourish the individual, it helped sustain the city-state itself. In Athenian society, sex was not divorced from politics, economy, or aesthetics. The brothel was not a den of sin. It was part of the rational order of a civilization that believed every aspect of human nature could be understood, managed, and put to use. In a culture where sexuality permeated every layer of society, from temples to classrooms, from stages to city squares, sexual power was not only used to seduce, satisfy, or elevate, but also to control, humiliate, and suppress. In ancient Greece, sex could become a punishment, brutal, public, and deeply political. Amid the constant warfare between city-states, rape was not merely a consequence of chaos, it was often seen as a legitimate part of conquest. When a city fell, women and children were treated as living spoils of war, subjected to mass rape in public spaces or sold into slavery. Yet this physical humiliation was not exclusive to women. Men, especially captured warriors or noblemen, could also become targets of sexual violence, as a means of stripping them of honour and masculine dignity. In the Greek mindset, a man who was sexually penetrated, regardless of whether by another man or even a woman, was considered to have lost his masculine power, to have been feminized, and thus no longer worthy of citizenship or status. To rape a man in public, therefore, was not an act of lust, but an act of symbolic annihilation. It turned him into a living mockery, a warning to others. This logic extended into legal punishment and slavery. Some ancient sources describe how rebellious slaves or criminals could be stripped naked, tied up, and raped in public as a form of corporal sentence, where the body was no longer a site of pleasure, but the stage for the collapse of dignity. Sex was also weaponized as a tool of political satire and social mockery, especially on the stage of old comedy. In the plays of Aristophanes, male characters were often depicted naked, or fitted with grotesquely exaggerated artificial phalluses, absurdly long and impossible not to notice. These weren't just for laughs. They turned the phallus, normally a symbol of male power, into something ridiculous. The erect penis became a prop for ridicule, a tool of political commentary and a visual insult. In The Clouds, The Frogs, or Lysistrata, sexual imagery wasn't merely comic, it pierced through to deeper critiques of hypocrisy, senseless warfare, and the incompetence of the ruling class. Sometimes an erection on stage was more damning than any speech. To the ancient Greeks, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a form of power, and like all power, it could heal and uplift, but also torment, degrade, and destroy even the strongest of identities. Beneath the smooth ivory marble lay a world where flesh could be venerated like a god, or shattered like a curse. In the ancient Greek world, where sexuality was not merely a need but a cosmological, sociological, and religious symbol, it is no surprise that the phallus, the ultimate emblem of male vitality, was worshipped with both seriousness and reverence. At the forefront of the divine pantheon of erotic forces stood Priapus, a minor god, not as grand as Zeus or Apollo, yet omnipresent in the daily life of the people, especially in rural communities. Priapus was instantly recognizable, a small-statured figure, perpetually flushed with wine, and, most strikingly, endowed with a massive, permanently erect penis, as if carrying an eternal sentence or sacred mission. But this image was not for laughter. Priapus was the guardian of gardens, fertility, virility, and the productive power of nature. His statues were often placed at gateways, gardens and fields, especially by farmers and merchants, with the belief that his divine presence would protect property from evil, theft, and infertility. People would touch or stroke the statue's phallus as a ritual, sometimes whispering prayers, sometimes merely as habit, believing that contact with the god's member could transfer life force, particularly for those longing for a son or for a husband to regain his vigour. Women were even known to bathe Priapus' statue during festivals, anointing his oversized member with scented oils in ancient fertility rites. The veneration of the phallus was not confined to temples or farmlands, it permeated everyday objects. On bowls, candlesticks, jewellery boxes, the phallus appeared frequently, often stylized, sometimes explicit. Amulets, keychains, necklaces, and even wind chimes shaped like phalluses were used as talismans, not just to bring good fortune and boost virility, but to ward off evil spirits, functioning as a kind of sacred vulgarity against malevolence. In ancient Greek thinking, the erotic was not opposed to the sacred. It could be part of it. When you laugh at a statue of Priapus, red-faced and ludicrously endowed, the ancients wouldn't find you amusing. They'd see you as missing the profound seriousness of life force itself, and in a time when people believed the universe was governed by fertility principles, where life emerged from seeds, blood, semen, and ecstasy, the worship of the phallus was not perverse, but sacred. It was a ritual act to safeguard existence, a way to honour the unstoppable, chaotic creative energy that binds mortals, gods, and the earth itself. At festivals reserved for men, often centred around wine, intellectual exchange, and the performance of masculinity, competitions in erotic arts became both a serious and delightfully provocative activity. Who could describe pleasure most vividly? Who could make the entire symposium laugh, or blush? Who could paint scenes of ecstasy with bold strokes that thrilled without descending into vulgarity? These were the criteria of a unique arena where desire became artistic material, no less worthy than philosophy or epic poetry. These contests were not typically held in the stately city of Athens, where public decorum was taken more seriously, but flourished in smaller city-states such as Thebes, Delos, or on the islands, places where the Dionysian spirit of excess and boundary-breaking ran strong. Here, verses describing vaginas as blossoms, penises as warhorses, and semen as the nectar of the gods were not seen as obscene, but as evidence of poetic skill and an enlightened understanding of sexuality. The painting competitions were no less competitive. Artists were invited to display their talent before an audience, sketching on pottery shards or directly onto amphorae, creating vivid depictions of intercourse, ménage à trois, orgies, or imaginative sexual positions beyond the mundane. Victors didn't just receive material rewards, they were often honoured by having their names inscribed on the vessels, or commissioned to create private erotic artworks for wealthy patrons. These works did not vanish with time. Countless excavated pots, wall fragments, and broken ceramics reveal the popularity and technical diversity of sexual representation, from delicate brushwork to strikingly realistic anatomy, from satirical exaggeration to mythological grandeur. This legacy proves that in ancient Greek culture, eroticism was not separate from civilization. It was embedded in it, worthy of study, competition, and admiration. They did not separate reason from pleasure. Instead, they challenged both to coexist, to craft spaces where intellect and the body could joyfully walk hand in hand. Beneath the gleam of knowledge, art, and the celebration of pleasure, ancient Greek society remained one governed by rigid hierarchies of class, gender, and power. And within the vibrant tapestry of its sexual culture, pleasure was not equally distributed. It was allocated by status. At the centre of this system stood the free male citizen, the only person in society with full autonomy over his own pleasure. He could marry for duty, visit hetairae for passion, frequent brothels for release, fall in love with a youth as a philosophical exercise, or simply pleasure himself as a statement of self-sufficiency. His sexuality was not constrained by religious dogma or moral judgment, but only by social roles and power dynamics. In sharp contrast stood the respectable woman, the wife, the mother, confined to strict expectations. She was required to remain absolutely chaste before marriage, faithful afterward, and largely uneducated in matters of sex. Her role was to bear sons and uphold the family's honour. To express or even experience sexual pleasure was something unspoken, unpermitted, and unthinkable. And yet, one striking exception existed: the hetairae, the elite courtesans who enjoyed a freedom, education, and access to power that traditional women could never dream of. They could discuss philosophy with Socrates, attend symposia with statesmen, or advise political figures through carefully measured intimacy. In a society that kept most women in the shadows, hetairae walked in the light, not because they were fully accepted, but because they wielded pleasure as a tool of intellect. In this light, sexuality in ancient Greece was not simply a private experience, it was a mechanism of social stratification. Who had the right to enjoy pleasure? Who was allowed to grant it? Who was the subject, and who the object? Every answer drew the contours of power within that society. For men, sex was part of their identity, a space to perform masculinity, intellect, and social standing. For women, it was stifled by duty. For hetairae, it became a means of transcending biology, and even redefining the female role within a male-dominated world. In the end, sexuality in ancient Greece was never just about pleasure, it was a mirror reflecting power. And the real story of desire was not just about who was pleasured, but who held the mirror. Though thousands of years have passed, the sexual practices of ancient Greece continue to intrigue, provoke, and echo throughout Western culture, as if those marble statues are still whispering of desire, power, and intellect, hidden within the folds of history. To the modern eye, many of these ancient customs, pederasty, phallophoric festivals, or the ritual use of semen, may appear bizarre, even unethical. Public intercourse, the worship of phallic symbols, and the legal existence of sexual slavery can feel deeply unsettling or morally unacceptable today. Yet these discomforts don't erase a simple truth. modern Western civilization was largely built upon the cultural legacy of ancient Greece, including its philosophies about sex. When Rome inherited and expanded the Greek world, it did not just carry forward its art and philosophy, but also its sexual traditions, fertility symbols, and the view of pleasure as a natural part of life. Even during the Renaissance, when Europe was weighed down by religious moralism, scholars and artists turned back to the classical Greek world in search of liberation, not only of thought, but also of the body and of sensual imagery. Nude gods, erotic frescoes, stories of Aphrodite, Eros, or the teacher-student dynamic of Socrates and Alcibiades all became sources of inspiration in art, literature, and modern philosophy. Pleasure was no longer something to be hidden. It was aestheticized, intellectualized, and reintegrated into culture, just as the ancient Greeks once had. Meanwhile, modern archaeology has played a critical role in uncovering the sexual imagination of antiquity. Thousands of vases, broken shards, sculptures, and ancient texts have been unearthed across the Greek world, from Athens to Delos, from the island of Lesbos to the rural fields of Corinth. These artifacts are not just archaeological data, they are living proof that pleasure was once public, legitimate, and even artistic. Alongside these, classical writings from Plato, Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Diogenes continue to be studied not only for their intellectual merit, but for what they reveal about how sex in ancient Greece was never separate from politics, education, or religion. It flowed into every part of life, a hidden but powerful current. In the end, the sexual legacy of ancient Greece is both a mirror of human instinct and a reminder of how deeply complex culture and morality truly are. It forces us to question our assumptions about what is natural, what is moral, and what is beautiful, and compels us to face an eternal truth. That pleasure, whether hidden or celebrated, has always been an essential part of human history. In the end, sexuality in ancient Greece was never just about physical gratification. It was religion, philosophy, ritual, and the language of power. It was where gods coupled to create the cosmos, where philosophers debated love amid gentle caresses, and where politics, art, education, and desire converged without clear boundaries. From a modern perspective, many of these practices, pederasty, phallophoria, ritual orgies, public acts of coercion, or phallic worship, may appear troubling, even morally unacceptable. But when viewed within the social, cultural, and intellectual context of ancient Greece, they are not symptoms of moral decay, but expressions of a world driven by a fundamentally different way of thinking. A world where pleasure was not imprisoned but studied, ritualized, and revered. In a society that prized beauty, knowledge, and freedom, sexuality became a mirror reflecting the essence of humanity, where desire did not stand in opposition to reason, but flowed alongside it, like twin rivers merging into a vast contradictory sea of culture. To truly understand ancient Greece, one cannot look away from its sexual life. It did not sit on the fringes of history. It stood at the very heart of civilization's discourse, woven into law, myth, politics, and art. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that to approach any civilization, especially one so foundational to our own, with honesty and depth, we must set aside judgment. Not to praise or imitate, but to recognize this, that human instinct, in every age, finds a way to speak, through the body, through ritual, and through history itself. The life of Aspasia, courtesan, philosopher, and the most powerful woman in Athens. She was not a wife, not a goddess, not born of noble blood. And yet, Aspasia made Pericles, the greatest statesman of Athens, turn his head. She drew the attention of Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, and she made even golden marble Athens pause, wonder, and, at times, bow. Aspasia did not enter history through battles. She has no statue in the public square. She entered history from the places society tried to keep hidden, the bed of the most powerful man in the city, the symposiums thick with wine and argument, the whispered conversations where love and politics blurred into one. In a world where women were kept behind walls, forbidden from speaking in public, and valued only for childbirth, Aspasia could debate philosophers, question politicians, and command herself, without a title, without a husband. But how? How could a woman, Not even a citizen of Athens, once a hetera, an elite courtesan, stepped so boldly into the heart of power. How could she, armed only with intellect, eloquence, and a magnetism not drawn from noble blood, carve her name into an age that refused to make space for women? It is this very contradiction between lowly status and towering intellect, between prostitute and teacher, lover and strategic advisor, that shaped the figure of Aspasia, a woman who did not live in darkness, but who also never walked in the light Athens reserved only for men. She was a shadow, cool, mysterious, formidable. And perhaps that's why Athens, the proud capital of reason, democracy and freedom, was forced to confront its deepest paradox. Freedom for whom? And is knowledge truly the domain of men alone? Aspasia, the woman who carried that question with her, still stands in history, caught between admiration and slander, an unsolved riddle no one has ever dared to fully decode. 5th century BCE, the golden age of Athens, a time when thought, art, science and politics bloomed as never before in human history. The age of Pericles, Socrates, Aeschylus, Phidias, the era of the Parthenon, soul-shaking tragedies, and philosophical debates that reached into the core of human existence. Athens stood as the beating heart of the Greek world, the birthplace of democracy, a city where every citizen had a voice in shaping the state, where reason was sacred and beauty itself was a way of life. But like all brilliant lights, Athens cast a deep shadow. Because Athenian democracy was not for everyone. It was reserved for a very small group, adult, freeborn males, whose parents were both Athenian citizens. Outside that privileged circle lived the vast majority, slaves, foreigners, women, and especially prostitutes. In that society, respectable women, wives, mothers, lived under strict codes of morality. They weren't educated. They couldn't go outside without a male guardian. They were not allowed to speak in public and were raised to manage the household, weave, and bear sons. They were guardians of male honour, not independent beings in their own right. And yet the hetera, the elite courtesans, held a strange and paradoxical power. They were not accepted by society, yet were invited into the symposium, the exclusive male-only banquets where no decent woman could set foot. They could not marry, yet became lovers, confidants and advisors to the most powerful men. They had no citizenship, yet shaped politics, philosophy and culture through intellect and intimacy. It was in this paradox that Aspasia emerged, a living embodiment of the razor-thin line between contempt and reverence, between desire and intellect, between being an outsider and moving at the very centre of power. She lived in a society that worshipped freedom, but she herself was not granted it. She had to claim it, through words, through her body, and through a mind that refused to fit into the roles prescribed to women. Understanding this world is the first step to understanding Aspasia, a woman who became both a legend and a quiet, enduring indictment of the very civilization she helped make brilliant. Aspasia was not born beneath the marble domes of Athens, nor raised under the protection of a noble lineage. She came from Miletus, a city of Ionia in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, a crossroads between Greece in the east and the birthplace of early philosophy, of Thales, Anaximander, and the first thinkers who dared to question the cosmos. But in Athens, Aspasia was an outsider, as a foreigner, a metic. She was excluded from all forms of citizenship, and as a woman, doubly so. Yet it was precisely this status of not belonging that set her on a path of defiance, across borders, beyond prejudice, and above the limits placed on her gender. In Miletus, Aspasia was not raised to obey. She was trained, educated, as a hetera, not merely a courtesan but a craftswoman of pleasure and intellect. She studied philosophy, rhetoric, music, poetry, and the art of negotiation, things no respectable Athenian wife was ever allowed to learn. She was not taught to submit. She was taught to master, in conversation and in bed. When Aspasia arrived in Athens, she had no citizenship, no family, no social standing. But she had intelligence, beauty, and a chilling kind of confidence that made her dangerous. And then she met Pericles. Pericles, the most powerful man in Athens, a master orator, a visionary statesman, the architect of the golden age that bears his name. Between them, there was no marriage. Athenian law forbade citizens from marrying foreigners, but there was a public life together, a child, and a partnership that went beyond love, almost a political alliance. From foreign hetera to the mind behind the throne, Aspasia entered the heart of Athens through a path no one expected, by influencing the affairs of the polis through sex and speech. From this moment on, her life was no longer that of a courtesan, but a walking contradiction, a body priced, but a mind beyond measure. Aspasia never asked for a place in society. She claimed it through the one thing that society could not contain, the thinking mind of a woman who knew exactly who she was. In a society where marriage was a political duty, love a luxury, and women forbidden from speaking in public, the relationship between Aspasia and Pericles was a dangerous anomaly, and a strangely beautiful one. At the time he met Aspasia, Pericles was not only Archon, chief magistrate of Athens, but the living embodiment of a city at the height of its power. Under his leadership, Athens built the Parthenon, expanded its naval empire, and became the intellectual and cultural heart of the Greek world. He was the voice of democracy, a patron of the arts, and the greatest orator of his time. And then he fell in love with a foreign courtesan. No one knows exactly when they met. What is clear is that once Aspasia entered Pericles' life, Athens' strict definitions of what a woman should be began to tremble. They never married. Pericles himself had passed the law forbidding citizens from marrying foreigners, but they lived together openly, defying social norms, and had at least one son together, though the boy was not legally recognised as a citizen. But their bond went far beyond love. Aspasia was not just a lover. She was a counsellor, a conversationalist, a woman who helped Pericles see the world through eyes that didn't belong to Athens. Some ancient sources, especially political enemies of Pericles, claimed that she helped him write his famous speeches, and may have even influenced state decisions. Plato, in the Menexenus, has Socrates joke that Pericles was merely Aspasia's puppet, repeating lines she had written for him. But behind the sarcasm lies a truth hard to ignore. Aspasia could speak, so well in fact that the greatest speaker in Athens may have borrowed her voice. There were rumours that she dragged Athens into war with Samos to defend her relatives, that she trained prostitutes, that Pericles did whatever she wished, bewitched by her beauty. But behind these accusations was a very real fear. Fear of a woman who could think, love, and use pleasure as a political language. Aspasia didn't need the title of wife to hold power. She had no legal status, yet she had influence. She never entered the Athenian assembly, but she shaped the minds of the men who sat within it. And Pericles, Athens' most powerful man, never hid her. He let her stand beside him, as living proof that power doesn't always wear a helmet and shield. Sometimes it sits in a thin dress in the middle of the room, smiling, saying things that make an entire city stop and listen. In the history of Western philosophy, few women have been remembered not as objects of desire, but as subjects of thought. Aspasia is one of those rare names, perhaps even the first. Not because she was officially a philosopher, but because she made even the greatest minds of her time pause, listen, and acknowledge. Thought can have a woman's voice. In Menexenus, a satirical dialogue by Plato, Socrates tells his student that the famous funeral oration delivered by Pericles, an iconic speech that would later define democratic rhetoric, was, in fact, written by Aspasia. He claims she was well versed in both philosophy and rhetoric, and that she trained Pericles into becoming a master orator. Though intended as parody, the remark carries an undeniable truth. Aspasia was heard, not just in bed, but in the realm of ideas. Socrates, in various accounts and dialogues, speaks of Aspasia with quiet reverence. According to Xenophon, he once advised a friend to consult her on how to treat his wife, saying that Aspasia understood human nature, love, and the art of living together. A woman, not a philosopher, not a scholar, not seated at a podium, was called teacher by the greatest philosopher of the ancient world in matters most profound. Aspasia was known to attend the symposia, drinking parties where philosophy and desire intertwined. There, she debated alongside orators and thinkers, provoking the intellect of men before their bodies succumbed to hers. She made the wisest men tremble, not from touch, but from speech. For Aspasia, sex was part of a philosophy of life, where body and mind were not separate, but flowed together in a continuous argument. In a world where women were considered not worth teaching, not worth hearing, and not worth remembering, Aspasia did not ask to be included in philosophy. She entered it, sat down, and forced the wisest men to argue with her. So when Plato has Socrates mockingly say that this woman taught orators how to speak, perhaps it was not just a joke. Perhaps it was an admission that the voice of Aspasia, though born in the body of a courtesan, transcended the boundaries of intellect and history. A beautiful woman is easily desired. A clever woman is easily feared. But a woman who is beautiful, intelligent, and politically influential in Athens, she's bound to become the target of both longing and loathing. With all her brilliance, Aspasia was never considered safe in the eyes of Athenian society, especially by playwrights, satirists, and Pericles' political rivals. In comedies and contemporary texts, she was ridiculed, slandered, and transformed into a symbol of moral decay. Aristophanes, the famed dramatist, and Hermippus, another comic poet, openly mocked her on stage, accusing her of training prostitutes, manipulating men, and leading heterae to destroy respectable families. She was nicknamed the Mother of Disgrace, blamed for instigating the war against Samos, allegedly because the island had insulted her relatives. This public fury wasn't entirely about what she did. It was about what she represented. A woman with no noble blood, no legal status, no submission to marital morality, yet one who dared to enter political life, engage in philosophical discourse, and speak as if she were a free citizen. She dared to love without permission, speak without apology, and think beyond her assigned role. Some ancient sources even claim that she was once brought to trial for impiety, a vague but dangerous charge in a society where religion and politics were tightly woven. Thanks to Pericles' public defence, she escaped punishment, but the episode only fueled suspicion and animosity around her. Not everyone saw Aspasia as a philosopher or political advisor. To many, she remained forever a courtesan, and the very idea that a courtesan could write speeches, debate philosophers, and sway state decisions was unthinkable. Yet that hatred itself is proof of her power. If Aspasia had merely been another beautiful hetera, she would have faded into obscurity as so many did. But because she crossed boundaries, too far, too boldly, too visibly, society was forced to respond. Mockery was the price the world demanded of a woman who refused to remain silent, and the insults, the slanders, became the clearest mirror of the power she once held. Not on paper, but in the minds of others, Aspasia was not a wife, not in the eyes of Athenian law, which denied her any legal status as a spouse, nor in the lineage of any noble family. Yet she lived as a true partner. She shared a life with Pericles, influenced his political decisions, bore his child, and was so cherished that he altered the law to secure their son's citizenship. In a society where wives were taught to submit, remain silent, and stay hidden, Aspasia, a woman denied the right to be a wife, lived as an equal and free companion. As a hetera, she entered spaces forbidden to respectable women. The symposia, those male-dominated gatherings where intellect and desire merged, where men drank, philosophized, and surrendered to their appetites. Proper women were banned from these rooms. Aspasia wasn't just allowed in, she ruled them, with her words, her mind, and a presence that could not be dismissed. In her hands, sexuality was not something to be controlled, it became a tool for navigation. Aspasia didn't shy away from the fact that she was seductive. She wielded it as part of her language. She made love as if negotiating, spoke as if caressing, and persuaded as if every dialogue might end in pleasure or revolution. By using desire not to surrender but to lead, Aspasia inverted the social order that cast men as subjects and women as instruments. She did not deny her status as a hetera. She transformed it, from a marginal role into a channel of knowledge, influence, and cultural power. Aspasia stands as the first archetype in Western history of a woman who could use her body without losing her intellect, who could embrace pleasure without surrendering agency. She turned desire into philosophy, and herself into a living symbol of a truth long suppressed, that a woman need not abandon her instincts to be a thinker, nor sacrifice her intellect to be loved. After Pericles' death during the plague, and as Athens slowly declined amid political upheaval, the name Aspasia vanished from state records, perhaps unsurprisingly, since she had never officially belonged to them. But in culture, memory and history, her image lingered and resurfaced, shifting through the ages, much like the way she once defied the limits of her own time. In antiquity, Aspasia was caricatured and slandered as a cunning courtesan, the woman who corrupted Pericles and tainted the ideals of Athens with female desire. But as later generations began to read history with sharper, more questioning eyes, especially in eras that re-examined the role of women, Aspasia began to emerge from beneath layers of mockery. She reappeared not merely as a courtesan, but as a strange and powerful archetype, a woman of intellect, a lover with influence, a mind that refused to be silenced. In Renaissance and Enlightenment paintings, Aspasia was reimagined as a philosophical muse, standing beside great thinkers, clothed in wisdom rather than wrapped in erotic mystique. In modern literature, she became a narrator, a proto-feminist icon, appearing in novels, plays and poems as a woman who lived 1,000 years ahead of her time. Through her, we begin to recognize a lineage of historical women who also challenged the systems around them. Cleopatra, who wielded love and intellect to shape empires. Madame de Pompadour, royal mistress and patron of Enlightenment thought. Simone de Beauvoir, existentialist philosopher who argued that women's freedom must embrace both body and mind. These women, like Aspasia, were not feared because they were wrong, but because they dared to exist too loudly in a world that demanded female silence. Aspasia was not simply Pericles' lover, she was a woman of Athens, of an Athens deeper than its politics or art, an Athens of intellect born from passion, of democracy challenged by the presence of someone with no right to vote. In a world where women were told to stay quiet, stay indoors, veil their faces and bury their knowledge, Aspasia spoke, with words, with deliberate presence, with pleasure used as political language. Though history denied her citizenship, and no statue of her stands among the great philosophers, culture has kept her alive, not as a fading shadow, but as a burning landmark. Aspasia is ancient proof that women do not need permission to be powerful, they only need to be written back correctly. And when we read her name again, between the jeers of ancient comedy and the reverence of philosophers, we understand. If history is the stage of power, then Aspasia performed her role, with intellect, sensuality and quiet defiance, in a way no one could ever forget. Ancient Greek clothing. Beneath the sun-drenched skies of the Mediterranean, the civilization of ancient Greece flourished as one of humanity's greatest pinnacles of intellect and art. Beyond philosophy, sculpture and architecture, the Greeks also left an enduring legacy in lifestyle, aesthetics, and in the way they dressed. To them, clothing was not merely utilitarian, it was a reflection of culture. Unlike modern fashion, which relies on precise tailoring and structure, ancient Greek garments were made from large rectangular pieces of fabric, with no sleeves, no collars, and no buttons. These pieces were wrapped, folded, pinned, and belted, transforming simple cloth into garments of flowing elegance, suited both for daily life and sacred ritual. Under the intense Mediterranean sun, Greeks favoured cool linen and warm wool, often in muted tones with minimal patterns. This simplicity reflected their values, a lifestyle of moderation, balance, and quiet sophistication. The pleats of the chiton, the layered folds of the peplos, or the graceful drape of the himation all echoed a central ideal in Greek aesthetics. The celebration of the human form, balanced, natural, and harmonious. Clothing also served as a marker of gender, social status, and role. Nobles wore rare, purple-dyed fabrics. Soldiers donned short cloaks suited for movement and combat, and common women wore modest, monochrome dresses, neat and practical. Every detail, from the bronze or gold fibula fastening a shoulder to the neatly tied leather sandals, carried the essence of a society built on vitality, order, and quiet mastery of craft. The clothing of ancient Greece was far from accidental. It was the result of a careful convergence between the natural environment, social structure, and the aesthetic values of its time. Every element of historical context, from climate and class hierarchy to philosophical ideals, played a role in shaping the style, materials and use of clothing. Greece, located in southern Europe and surrounded by sea, enjoys a Mediterranean climate, hot, dry summers and mild winters with little rain. This environment had a direct impact on the design and materials used for clothing. Unlike people in colder regions, Greeks did not need thick, insulating garments. Instead, they favoured light, breathable fabrics like linen and fine wool, which allowed the skin to breathe while still offering protection from the sun. Their clothing typically had no sleeves, featured loose, flowing folds, and was draped in a way that moved naturally with the body, perfectly suited to the heat and outdoor lifestyle of the region. Ancient Greek society was highly stratified. Citizens, aristocrats, women, foreigners, and slaves each had distinct roles, and these divisions were often visibly marked by clothing. Wealthy citizens and nobility wore longer garments made from finer materials, often dyed in deeper colours and adorned with decorative borders or woven patterns. Accessories like metal brooches, belts, bracelets, or ornamental bands served as additional markers of status. In contrast, slaves and labourers wore simpler, shorter garments, often undyed, undecorated, and designed purely for practicality. In many cases, their attire consisted of just a basic cloth wrapped around the body, with no adornments at all. In this way, clothing functioned not only as a necessity, but also as a social code, visually communicating power, privilege, or servitude. One of the most striking features of ancient Greek culture was its veneration of the human form, both physical and intellectual. In sculpture, the human body was considered an ideal, portrayed with balanced proportions, defined muscles, and composed expressions. Greek philosophy also valued beauty tied to moderation, harmony, and simplicity. These ideals strongly influenced how people dressed. Instead of heavy fabrics that hid the body, or excessive ornamentation, the Greeks preferred draped garments with natural folds that followed the body's contours. This created an effect that was elegant yet restrained, aligned with their worldview that praised simplicity, proportion, and a life lived in balance. Ancient Greek clothing was characterized by structural simplicity and visual refinement. Unlike modern garments tailored to fit the body, Greek attire was made from large rectangular pieces of fabric that were folded, pinned, and draped to create elegant silhouettes. Depending on gender, social status, and historical period, these garments were adapted in subtle but meaningful ways, reflecting both personal identity and the broader aesthetic ideals of the time. The chiton was the most basic and widely worn garment for men. Made from a rectangular piece of cloth, with or without sleeves, it was wrapped around the body and fastened at the shoulders, then secured with a belt or girdle at the waist. Its length usually reached the knees, allowing for ease of movement, ideal for both everyday tasks and labour. During the Archaic period, chitons were typically made from wool, in the solid colours, and had a stiffer texture. By the Classical era, lighter materials like linen became popular, allowing for softer folds and more fluid draping. The chiton could be worn on its own, or paired with an outer garment, depending on the wearer's status and the occasion. The himation was a large outer cloak, often worn over the chiton. It consisted of a larger rectangular cloth, draped diagonally around the body, often leaving the right shoulder exposed, creating a look that was both dignified and classical in appearance. Men wore the himation in public settings, such as political assemblies, religious rituals, and formal events. Beyond its function as protection against the elements, the himation was also a symbol of status and decorum. Nobles and philosophers favoured versions made of soft, neutral-coloured fabrics, carefully arranged to fall in natural flowing folds. The chlamys, by contrast, was a short cloak designed for practical use and mobility. It was fastened over one shoulder with a fibula, a type of decorative pin, and worn primarily by young men, soldiers, and travellers. Compact and lightweight, the chlamys was well suited for activities like horseback riding, hunting, or marching. Unlike the formal and reserved appearance of the himation, the chlamys had a livelier, more functional style. Often made of wool and dyed in brighter colours, it sometimes featured simple border decorations reflecting both energy and utility. The peplos was the traditional and most commonly worn garment by women during the Archaic period. 8th and 6th century BCE. Made from a large rectangular piece of fabric folded vertically, it created a double layer at the chest called the apoptygma. The fabric was pinned at both shoulders, leaving the arms bare, and then belted at the waist to shape the form. Typically woven from wool, the peplos had a thick and modest appearance, with fabric that draped naturally over the body, highlighting the grace and softness often associated with the ideal of Greek femininity. Beyond everyday wear, the peplos held ceremonial significance. During religious festivals such as the Panathenaea, specially made peploi were offered to the goddess Athena as sacred gifts. By the classical period, 5th–4th century BCE, the Ionic chiton became more fashionable than the peplos. Unlike the male version, the female chiton was floor-length and made from light, airy linen, allowing for elaborate and flowing folds. The Ionic chiton was often pinned along the shoulders and down the arms at multiple points, creating the illusion of short or long sleeves. This style emphasized refinement, lightness, and subtle elegance, aligning with the Greek aesthetic ideal to celebrate the human form without overt exposure. Much like men, women also wore the himation as an outer layer, especially when going outdoors or attending formal events. Draped over the shoulders and covering much of the body, the himation conveyed a sense of dignity and modesty, in line with societal expectations of female propriety. Depending on wealth and social standing, women's himation could be made from fine wool or high-quality linen, occasionally dyed in soft colours and embellished with simple yet elegant embroidery along the edges. Though Greek clothing was simple in construction, it reflected a deep balance between function and aesthetics. Whether it was a man in a chiton walking through the agora, or a woman in a peplos offering tribute at a temple, every fold of fabric spoke to a civilization that revered beauty, restraint, and harmony with nature. The core values at the heart of ancient Greek identity. Beyond clothing, accessories and jewellery played an essential role in completing one's appearance and reflecting social status in ancient Greek society. While not as elaborate as in some other ancient cultures, Greek accessories were marked by refinement, practicality, and a deep connection to the classical ideal of beauty, where aesthetics were rooted in harmony, simplicity, and grace. One of the most common and practical accessories was the belt, known as the zone. Especially prevalent in women's attire, belts were made from fabric cords, leather strips, or braided threads. They were tied around the waist or just below the bust to shape garments like the chiton or peplos, which were otherwise loose and flowing. For women, belts served more than just a practical purpose. They highlighted the natural curves and helped create an elegant silhouette, perfectly aligning with the Greek aesthetic of natural beauty, subtly enhanced by thoughtful arrangement. For men, belts were also used to secure garments at the waist, especially during physical activity, labour or combat, offering both form and function. In many parts of ancient Greece, going barefoot was common, especially indoors or in daily routines. However, when venturing outside, people often wore sandals, sandalia, the most typical form of footwear. These were thin-soled shoes made from leather or wood, fastened with straps that wrapped around the ankles or calves, offering both comfort and flexibility. Footwear in ancient Greece served not only to protect the feet, but also as a marker of social status. Wealthier individuals wore finely crafted sandals, sometimes adorned with precious metals or intricate designs. In contrast, slaves and the poor typically went barefoot throughout the day, a visible sign of their lower position in society. Jewellery, in ancient Greek culture, was far more than decoration. It was a symbol of wealth, spiritual belief, and even personal protection. Materials used included gold, silver, bronze, and gemstones, with gold being the most prized and reserved for the elite. Common types of jewellery included bracelets, necklaces, and earrings, often designed with geometric patterns, laurel leaves, or motifs inspired by gods and mythology. Rings, sometimes engraved with religious symbols or initials, hair ribbons or headbands, typically worn by women during festivals or religious ceremonies. Jewellery not only enhanced one's appearance, but also served spiritual and symbolic functions, often believed to ward off evil or to express devotion to a deity. In an era without buttons, zippers, or sewn fasteners, fibulae, ancient pins or brooches, played a crucial role in dressing. These metal clasps were used to hold garments like the chiton, peplos, or hymathion in place. most often at the shoulders or across the chest. Fibulae came in a range of shapes and materials, from simple bronze pins to elaborate pieces made of silver or gold, sometimes set with gemstones and engraved with decorative patterns. Especially for women, fibulae added both functionality and elegance, becoming a focal point in ceremonial dress or public events. In essence, accessories and jewellery in ancient Greek culture provided the perfect counterbalance to the minimalist nature of clothing. They not only completed the outfit, but also conveyed social identity, aesthetic values, and a deep cultural connection to art, religion, and mythology. Core elements of ancient Greek life. Though ancient Greek garments were simple in structure, they reflected a refined sense of material selection and colour aesthetics. Depending on social class, function, or specific occasions, Greeks chose fabrics that served both practical needs and visual harmony. Ancient Greeks primarily used three main types of fabric. Wool, the most common textile in daily life. Wool was woven from sheep's fleece, making it readily available and well suited to Greece's climate. It provided moderate insulation, making it ideal for cooler weather and for garments like himation or chlamys. Linen, lightweight, breathable, and cool. Linen was favoured during the hot Mediterranean summers. Women's ionic chitons were often made of linen to allow soft draping and fine pleats that emphasised grace and elegance. Silk. Extremely rare and expensive, silk was reserved for the upper class or nobility. Imported primarily from the East, it was seen as a symbol of luxury and power. At first, Greek clothing tended to maintain the natural shades of the fabric, such as white, beige, or light brown. However, over time, people began to experiment with natural dyes derived from plants, minerals, and insects, giving rise to a broader palette of colours. Reds and deep blues were among the most accessible dyes and commonly used in everyday garments. Purple, derived from the murex sea snail, was the most expensive and rare colour. Due to its high cost and labour-intensive dyeing process, purple became a symbol of aristocracy, often worn by nobility or religious elites. In ancient Greece, colour wasn't just aesthetic, it was a form of non-verbal communication, helping distinguish social class at a glance. While Greek fashion did not rely heavily on embellishment, decorative elements were still used to enhance visual appeal and convey cultural meaning. Popular motifs included geometric patterns such as the meander, or Greek key, triangles, wave motifs, all symbolising concepts like order, eternity, and harmony. Additionally, mythological themes, including depictions of gods, legendary creatures, and battle scenes, were sometimes embroidered or woven directly into ceremonial or festive garments. These decorative features were not just artistic expressions, but also reflections of religious belief, cultural identity, and fine craftsmanship in ancient Greek society. In ancient Greek society, clothing was far more than a material necessity. It served as a mirror reflecting the cultural, social, and philosophical values of the time. By simply observing the fabric, colour, and complexity of one's attire, it was possible to identify a person's social status. Members of the aristocracy wore garments made from silk or fine wool, richly dyed and often trimmed with decorative borders. They also adorned themselves with luxurious jewellery. Commoners, on the other hand, wore plain fabrics, often undyed or in pale tones, with minimal to no embellishment. Slaves typically wore coarse, short garments, sometimes nothing more than a simple cloth wrapped around the body. In this way, clothing functioned as a non-verbal language, establishing and reinforcing social hierarchy in a clear and effective manner. The aesthetic ideals of ancient Greece were grounded in principles of harmony, moderation, and respect for natural beauty. Rather than concealing the human form, their clothing was designed to enhance the body's natural shape, highlighting soft curves, balance, and refined elegance. Fabrics were draped and pleated naturally to follow the contours of the body. This was not only visually appealing, but also expressed a deeper philosophical notion, that beauty lies in natural simplicity and equilibrium. The influence of ancient Greek fashion remains visible in modern design, particularly in evening wear, bridal fashion, and performing arts costumes. Flowing, pleated dresses directly draw inspiration from the chiton and peplos. One-shoulder draped gowns echo the style of the himation. Even the widely celebrated notion of minimalism with elegance in today's fashion aesthetics can trace its philosophical roots back to ancient Greece. Thus, the garments of the ancient Greeks are not merely historical artifacts. They are a living cultural legacy, one that continues to inspire and shape fashion and design across the centuries. Ancient Greek clothing was far more than fabric draped around the body. It was a fusion of art, philosophy, and cultural identity, woven into the very fabric of one of history's most brilliant civilizations. Through each pleat, material, and arrangement, the Greeks expressed a distinct aesthetic worldview, one that celebrated natural beauty, harmony of form, and a lifestyle that was simple yet profound. Clothing, in this sense, was not merely a tool for daily use. It served as a visual language, carrying with it the social, ethical, and philosophical values of the age. The value of ancient Greek dress did not lie in its complexity or ornamentation, but in its ability to transform simple elements into symbols of refinement and intellect. For this reason, even after thousands of years, the styles worn by the ancient Greeks continue to exert a powerful influence on art and fashion today. From haute couture runways to stage costume design, contemporary creators still draw inspiration from the flowing lines of the chiton, the elegant drape of the himation, and the understated grace of the peplos, bringing the spirit of antiquity into modern forms that resonate globally. Yet beyond aesthetics, the study of ancient Greek dress offers a deeper insight into how the Greeks thought, how their society was structured, and how they saw the world. Clothing becomes a key that unlocks a cultural space where beauty is inseparable from wisdom and where life itself is shaped by the intersection of art and philosophy. To understand how a people dressed is to understand how they lived, and to understand how the ancient Greeks lived is to understand a vital chapter in the foundation of Western civilization.